Astoria, Queens was quiet that night. The usual city noise had died down to a low hum, just the distant wail of sirens somewhere far away, the occasional honk of a late-night taxi, and the rustling of leaves in the summer breeze. It was the kind of silence that felt almost unnatural, the kind that settled over a place just before something terrible happened. Inside a modest apartment complex on a tree-lined street, a sudden sharp noise cut through the quiet. It wasn't the sound of the usual city chaos. It wasn't the rhythmic creaking of old pipes or the dull thud of a door closing. This was different, a singular, unmistakable impact, a noise that seemed out of place. Some of the residents stirred in their sleep. A few briefly opened their eyes, listening, before dismissing it as just another domestic argument, just another fight between lovers that wasn't theirs to get involved in. Then, somewhere in the dark, a phone call was made. At 2:45 a.m., a dispatcher at 911 answered to a voice barely above a whisper. The caller sounded hesitant, almost afraid to speak too loudly, as if they feared being overheard. Apartment 3A. Something bad happened. Someone needs help. The words hung in the air for only a moment before the call abruptly ended. No name, no details, just a location and a warning. When officers arrived, the building looked as ordinary as any other on the block. The exterior was unremarkable, the front door locked as it should be. A few apartment windows still glowed faintly from late-night television screens. Nothing seemed overtly out of place, yet there was a heaviness in the air, an uneasy stillness that didn't belong. They knocked on the door of apartment 3A. At first, light raps with the knuckles, then harder, more forceful pounding. No response. No movement, nothing but silence. The officers exchanged glances. Standard procedure dictated that they check for signs of forced entry, pried locks, shattered glass, anything that would indicate a break-in. But the door was perfectly intact. No splintered wood, no signs of struggle. It was locked from the inside. Then one of them noticed something. A thin stream of water was seeping out from underneath the door. It was slow, almost imperceptible, forming a darkened trail on the wooden floor of the hallway. That was strange. And then there was the smell. It hit them like a slow, creeping realization. Something foul, something off. Not just the musty dampness of old pipes or stale air. This was different. This was something organic, something that didn't belong in a normal lived-in apartment. One officer reached for his radio, requesting backup. The other positioned himself at the door, bracing for what they both knew was coming. They didn't have time to wait. With one swift motion, they forced the door open. The apartment was dark, save for the faint glow of a kitchen light left on. The air inside was thick, heavy with the suffocating scent of something rotten. The living room showed no immediate signs of struggle, no shattered furniture, no overturned chairs, just an eerie stillness. Then they stepped forward, following the thin trail of water that led them to the bathroom. What they found behind that door would haunt them forever. The moment the door gave way, the officers were hit by a wall of putrid air, thick and suffocating. Even in a city where people live stacked on top of one another, where the smells of urban life could be overwhelming, this was something else entirely. It was the unmistakable scent of decay, of something deeply and irrevocably wrong. They moved cautiously, flashlights cutting through the darkness as they stepped inside. The apartment was eerily quiet. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass. The living room was perfectly in place, too much so. A purse sat undisturbed on the coffee table, a pair of heels neatly positioned by the door, a wine glass with a lipstick stain perched on the counter, half empty, as if its owner had been interrupted before finishing. But their eyes were drawn immediately to the water. A steady trickle still seeped from the bathroom, creeping across the tile floor and pooling at the base of the hallway. It had been running long enough to create a subtle, damp musk in the air, mixing with the stench that made their stomachs turn. They stepped forward, hands instinctively resting on their holsters. The apartment might have been silent, but there was an oppressive weight to the space, as if whatever had happened here still lingered in the walls, in the air itself. One officer reached out and slowly pushed the bathroom door open. The light flickered, casting a dull glow over the tiled room. The bathtub was filled to the brim, murky water lapping gently against its edges. But it wasn't just water. Floating in the bath, motionless, was the body of a woman. She was fully clothed, her body partially submerged, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Her face, once undoubtedly beautiful, was bruised and swollen, her lips slightly parted as if frozen in the middle of a final breath. Wet strands of blonde hair clung to her pale skin. One officer instinctively reached for his radio, calling it in. "We have a deceased female. Possible homicide." His voice was controlled, professional, but the gravity of the scene was unmistakable. This wasn't a natural death. This wasn't an accident. This was something deliberate, something violent. The officers moved closer, careful not to disturb the scene. The water was still chillingly cold. Someone had attempted to slow decomposition, to buy themselves time. But there were other details that couldn't be hidden. The bruises, the contusions along her arms and neck, the faint marks around her wrists as if they had been restrained. One officer scanned the bathroom for signs of forced entry or struggle, but there was nothing out of place. No shattered mirror, no signs of a violent fight. It was calculated. And then, on the counter, they found something chilling. A handwritten note, slightly crumpled, as if it had been gripped tightly before being left behind. The ink was smudged, but the words were still legible. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." The discovery sent a ripple of unease through both officers. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was something deeply personal. Someone had cared enough to leave a note, but not enough to spare her life. The next step was clear. They needed to identify the victim, track her movements, and figure out who had been the last person to see her alive. One of the officers stepped back into the living room, scanning the apartment again, looking for anything that could provide immediate answers. His eyes fell on a framed photo on the shelf. A smiling woman, the same one now lying lifeless in the tub, arm wrapped around a tall, dark-haired man. It was the first real lead. They had a name, and now they needed to find him. The air inside the apartment was thick with the weight of what had happened. The two officers stood in silence for a moment, taking in the scene, their professional instincts taking over as they forced their emotions to the side. The job required it. No room for hesitation, no space for horror, only observation, deduction, and action. The body in the bathtub belonged to a woman in her late 20s, blonde hair, well-dressed even in death. The cold water had done little to hide the deep bruising along her arms and neck. She had suffered. That much was evident. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a tragic misstep in a night of excess. Someone had done this to her, and someone had gone to great lengths to delay the discovery. One officer, still processing the scene, turned his attention to the framed photograph on the shelf. The woman in the picture was smiling, radiating life, arms wrapped around a tall man, his dark eyes locked on the camera, his face frozen in a look that now seemed almost unreadable. Was it love, possession, control? The officer's gut told him that this was a relationship worth scrutinizing. A name was scrawled in elegant cursive along the bottom of the frame. Danielle Thomas and Jason. No last name, just Jason. But that was enough to start. The first order of business was confirming the victim's identity. While one officer called it in, the other began scanning the apartment, searching for a wallet, ID, or anything that could solidify the link between the woman in the tub and the name beneath the photo. It didn't take long. A purse sat neatly on the kitchen counter, untouched. Inside, they found a driver's license belonging to Danielle Thomas, her face younger and brighter in the picture, without the bruises and the emptiness they had just seen. Danielle was 27 years old, a financial analyst with a well-paying job in the city. She had no known criminal history, no immediate signs of drug abuse, no apparent reason to be caught up in something so violent. Yet here she was, murdered in her own home, left to be found in a way that suggested either remorse or cruelty. The note beside the sink haunted them. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Did she write it? Was it a forced confession? Or was it the killer's way of twisting the narrative, shaping the story before investigators could? As the officers took in the details, they noted that nothing in the apartment had been ransacked. No broken locks, no signs of a struggle beyond what had been inflicted upon her body. It didn't fit the profile of a random break-in or a robbery gone wrong. This was personal, the kind of personal that left bruises in hidden places, the kind that made victims stay even when they knew they should leave. By the time the forensic team arrived, the hallway outside had filled with the quiet shuffle of professionals who had seen it all before. Photographers moved through the space, capturing the apartment as it was found. Every angle, every detail, the body in the tub, the waterlogged note, the eerie cleanliness of a home that should have been chaotic. One of the forensic analysts crouched beside the bathtub, careful not to disturb the water. "The body's been in there for a while," she muttered, mostly to herself. "Whoever did this wasn't in a hurry. They had time." That meant one thing. The suspect had either stayed after the act or returned later to stage the scene. Another officer was already checking the apartment's security system. Danielle's building had an intercom-controlled entrance, meaning whoever came in that night had either been let in by her or had access to a key. A forced entry would have been loud, would have alerted neighbors. This wasn't that. They had a starting point. Danielle had known her killer. The next step was simple: find Jason. By morning, the investigation had already begun to take shape. Detectives were combing through Danielle's phone records, looking for her last calls and messages, her social media, her emails, anything that might point to the person she had been with last. The officers who had first arrived at the scene were now giving their initial reports, detailing the condition of the body, the placement of evidence, the gut feeling that this wasn't just another crime of passion, but something calculated. Then came the background checks. Danielle had never reported any violent incidents in her home. No restraining orders on file, no past police reports. To anyone outside her private life, she had seemed successful, stable, and in control of her life. But that was often the case, wasn't it? It wasn't until they dug deeper that the first cracks appeared. In her email history, buried under mundane work conversations and subscription notifications, was a series of messages to a close friend. Messages that told a different story. "I don't know what to do. He gets so angry, and then he apologizes, but it's getting worse. I think I need to leave, but he won't let me go. I'm scared of what will happen if I do." The words painted a picture that the crime scene had only hinted at: a relationship unraveling, a woman on the verge of escape, and someone who wasn't willing to let that happen. The detectives cross-referenced her messages with recent police calls. That's when they found it. Just weeks before, Danielle had reported a domestic incident. The details were limited, the call had ended before officers arrived, and no official report had been filed. But there, in the police logs, was a name: Jason Bone. Now, they weren't just looking for a man in a photograph. They were looking for a person of interest in a homicide investigation. The only problem? Jason was nowhere to be found. The investigation into Danielle Thomas's murder had taken a sharp turn. What had started as a horrific crime scene in a quiet apartment in Queens had now become something more: a manhunt. The forensic team had combed through every inch of the apartment, lifting prints, cataloging evidence, and analyzing the eerie stillness of a home where something terrible had unfolded. The bruises on Danielle's body told a silent story, one of pain, fear, and struggle. But the apartment itself told another. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that a stranger had come in the night to do this to her. Whoever had done this had been inside willingly, and that meant they had known her. The first real lead came from a framed photograph, the only personal touch in an otherwise sterile apartment. It showed Danielle smiling, arm wrapped around a tall, dark-haired man. He wasn't just a passerby in her life. He was central to it. The inscription on the frame read, "Danielle Thomas and Jason." Within hours, detectives confirmed his full name: Jason Bone. He wasn't just her boyfriend. He was also the subject of a prior police report involving Danielle, a domestic violence incident that had been filed but never pursued. The details were limited, but the logs showed that Danielle had called for help just weeks before her murder. And now Jason was missing. Detectives knew what this meant. People who vanish after a murder do so for a reason. Either they are victims themselves or they are guilty. There was no record of Jason being injured, no sign that he had been harmed, no missing persons report filed on his behalf. The only conclusion was that he was on the run. The clock was already ticking. If Jason had planned this, if he had a place to go, people who could help him, he could disappear for good. Every hour that passed without finding him was another hour closer to losing him forever. The first step was finding out when he had last been seen. Surveillance cameras inside Danielle's apartment building provided the first real insight into the timeline. The footage showed Danielle entering alone the night before she was found. She was carrying groceries, looking relaxed. There was no sign of distress, no hesitation in her steps. But at 11:30 p.m., a man entered the building. Tall, broad shoulders, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't struggle with the lock. He used a key. Jason Bone. He walked with confidence, moving straight to her apartment. He didn't pause, didn't look around. He knew exactly where he was going. And then, hours later, the footage went cold. No one else was seen entering or leaving the apartment. No one carrying a body, no one running in a panic. Jason had gone in, but by the time the police arrived, he was gone. Detectives replayed the footage over and over, trying to find a gap, an angle that had been missed. How could a man just disappear? If he had left, it had been through a way the cameras couldn't see. Inside the apartment, forensic analysts had been searching for anything that could tell them where Jason had gone. They had already found a disturbing set of messages, printed and stuffed in a shoebox in the closet. Messages Jason had sent to Danielle over the past few months. Some were filled with apologies, desperate attempts to pull her back in. Others were angry, full of accusations and warnings. One in particular sent a chill through the room. "You think you can leave, but you won't. I won't let you." They had seen words like these before. They always ended the same way. Fingerprint analysis provided another confirmation. Jason's prints were found on the bathroom light switch, the door handle, and the edge of the sink. He had been there, had touched those surfaces, had left his mark in places that told them he had staged the scene carefully. Detectives needed to know where he had gone next. They pulled his bank records, his phone records, his credit cards, and then nothing. His phone had been shut off the night of the murder. His credit cards hadn't been used since the day before. His bank account remained untouched. This wasn't someone running in a panic. This was someone who had prepared to disappear. Jason had money. He had resources, yet he wasn't using any of them. That meant he had help, or he had a plan. The first step in finding him was calling the people closest to him. His parents, who lived in Florida, denied having seen or heard from him. His workplace reported that he hadn't shown up in days. His friends gave vague, rehearsed-sounding answers. "I haven't heard from him in a while. I don't know what's going on. I hope he's okay." One name stood out. A college friend Jason had remained close with over the years. Detectives called him, noting the hesitation in his voice. He claimed he hadn't heard from Jason, but something about his tone suggested he was choosing his words carefully. Then came the first breakthrough. At a gas station in New Jersey, 2 hours after Danielle had been estimated to have died, a security camera caught an image of a man filling up a gas tank. The footage was grainy, but the man's height, build, and the way he carried himself matched Jason's. The timestamp proved that Jason hadn't just left the apartment. He had left New York entirely. Detectives traced the license plate on the car in the footage, hoping for an easy link. But when they checked the rental records, they found something unexpected. The car wasn't rented in Jason's name. Someone else had rented it. If Jason was using someone else's identity, it would be harder to track him. He wasn't using his own money, wasn't making obvious mistakes. But now they had a direction. He was heading south. A nationwide BOLA was issued for Jason Bone, officially listing him as a person of interest in a homicide investigation. Every police station along the I-95 corridor, a major escape route for criminals leaving New York, was notified. If Jason kept moving, if he made one wrong turn, one mistake, one stop that left a trail, they would be waiting for him. Jason was out there, running, hiding, but no one could stay hidden forever. The search for Jason Bone was no longer just a police investigation. It had become a full-scale manhunt, stretching beyond New York, beyond Queens, beyond state lines. Every passing hour widened the gap between him and the detectives trying to track him down. He had vanished with no credit card activity, No digital footprint, no traceable phone signal. It was as if he had prepared for this moment long before it happened. Law enforcement officials had seen cases like this before. Criminals who disappeared in a panic often made mistakes, using their credit cards in a rush, making desperate phone calls, reaching out to the wrong people. But Jason had done none of those things. His calculated silence was what made him so dangerous. He wasn't just running, he was erasing himself. The only clue they had was the grainy security footage from a New Jersey gas station, showing a man matching Jason's description, filling up a car's gas tank 2 hours after Danielle's estimated time of death. But the car wasn't his. The rental records showed it had been booked under another name, someone who wasn't Jason Bone. That meant he had help. Someone had either given him their vehicle or rented it for him, and if someone was willing to do that, then they knew exactly what was happening. Detectives started by pulling all rental car transactions from companies in the area, cross-referencing names with Jason's known contacts. The process was tedious, but it paid off faster than expected. One name stood out, a man who had attended college with Jason years ago, someone he had stayed in touch with over the years. The name on the rental agreement matched someone from Jason's past. When detectives called, the man hesitated before answering. His voice was uneven, the kind of tone that suggested he had rehearsed his response, but still wasn't sure how much to say. "I haven't talked to Jason in a while," he said too quickly. "I don't know where he is." But that wasn't true. When asked about the rental car, his hesitation became obvious. He tried to claim his wallet had been stolen, that someone must have used his ID to rent the vehicle. But his voice wavered, and the detectives knew better. Guilt sounded different over the phone. They didn't push too hard. Not yet. If he was lying, pressing him immediately would only make him shut down. Instead, they let him believe they weren't entirely convinced of his involvement. They gave him time to think, time to wonder if Jason would turn on him. While detectives worked that angle, another officer reviewed additional security footage from the gas station. A second clip surfaced, this one showing Jason getting back into the rental car and driving south. That told them everything they needed to know. He wasn't hiding out in New York. He was running south. Law enforcement immediately sent out alerts to state police in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and beyond. If Jason had chosen to take I-95, one of the busiest highways for criminals fleeing New York, then he was heading straight into areas where police checkpoints and surveillance cameras were plentiful. The detectives needed to get ahead of him. Every state trooper along the I-95 corridor was given Jason's description. Hotels and motels along the highway were sent his photo, with instructions to alert authorities if anyone resembling him checked in. It was a strategy that had worked before. Fugitives could run, but eventually they needed a place to rest. Meanwhile, detectives circled back to Jason's old college friend. Within hours of their first call, he cracked. The pressure had gotten to him. Maybe it was fear of being charged as an accomplice, or maybe he realized Jason wasn't worth protecting. Either way, his story changed. He admitted that Jason had called him the night of the murder. He didn't say much, only that he needed a favor, needed a car, needed to get out of town. But the most critical detail was this. Jason had mentioned he was heading to Florida. It was enough. Authorities in Florida were immediately notified to be on alert. Jason had family there, parents who had already claimed they hadn't seen him. But now the police had a reason to believe otherwise. It wasn't a question of if Jason would be caught anymore. It was a question of when. The chase had shifted to Florida. The biggest challenge now wasn't just finding him, it was predicting his next move before he made it. Detectives had already confirmed that Jason wasn't using his credit cards or bank accounts. He had gone completely dark, avoiding digital trails, making it difficult to track him through the usual financial patterns most fugitives couldn't resist. He wasn't booking hotels under his real name, wasn't using public transportation where cameras could capture his face. But even the most careful fugitives made mistakes, and Jason was about to make his. For the next 48 hours, investigators worked tirelessly to piece together his possible movements. They spoke with colleagues from Jason's past, trying to determine if he had any known connections in Florida beyond his parents. They checked his old college records, previous addresses, and distant relatives. They looked into whether he had ever spoken about safe houses, places to disappear if he ever needed to. One name surfaced, a distant cousin living on the outskirts of Gainesville, Florida. The cousin hadn't been in touch with Jason in years, at least as far as police knew. But it was a lead, and at this stage in the chase, they couldn't afford to ignore any possibility. Florida law enforcement moved quickly. Surveillance on his parents' home in Fort Lauderdale was quietly increased, with unmarked vehicles keeping an eye on any unusual activity. If Jason tried to contact them, tried to sneak inside under cover of night, the officers would be waiting. But something about Jason's profile didn't fit the pattern of someone running straight home. He was too smart for that. He would have known that law enforcement would be watching his parents. He would have known that showing up in their driveway, desperate and out of options, would be the worst thing he could do. If Jason had learned anything in life, it was how to manipulate people, how to convince them to help him even when they shouldn't, which meant he was going to someone who wouldn't immediately suspect he was dangerous. That's why the cousin in Gainesville became the next best option. Detectives acted fast. A team was dispatched to Gainesville, blending into the quiet suburban landscape, watching for any sign of Jason or any unusual activity near the cousin's home. And then, the first break. A traffic camera caught the rental car Jason had been driving, passing through a toll booth just outside Orlando. That meant he was still in Florida. More importantly, he wasn't just sitting still, he was moving, and every movement increased the risk of being spotted. Detectives circulated the image to every officer in the area, notifying them that the car was confirmed to be used by a fugitive wanted in connection with a homicide. Patrols along major highways were intensified, and law enforcement started watching gas stations, motels, and convenience stores, the kinds of places a fugitive might need to stop at while on the run. A call came in from a small roadside motel off Route 75. A man matching Jason's description had checked in under an alias, paying in cash. He had stayed in his room most of the time, not interacting much with the staff, but the manager had noticed something off. The man had seemed anxious, jittery, like he was expecting someone to find him. That was all law enforcement needed. Within 20 minutes, unmarked vehicles had surrounded the motel. Officers moved in, cutting off any possible escape route, ensuring there would be no chase, no chance for Jason to slip away again. They had him. When the officers knocked on the door of room 206, there was no answer. A few moments passed. Then, the shuffle of movement from inside. Jason Bone knew. The chase was over. The air was thick with humidity as officers moved into position outside room 206 of the roadside motel. The parking lot, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs, was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the occasional hum of passing cars on the highway and the distant chatter from a convenience store nearby. Inside the room, Jason Bone knew. He might not have heard the unmarked cars pulling in, or the officers speaking in hushed tones as they coordinated their movements, but he felt it. The shift in the air, the way the motel, his temporary sanctuary, suddenly seemed too small, too still. He had spent the past few days running, avoiding cameras, using cash, keeping his head down. But deep down, he must have known this was coming. A fugitive could only stay ahead of the law for so long. The knock on the door was firm, deliberate, undeniable. "Jason Bone, this is law enforcement. Open the door now." Silence. Inside, Jason stood still, every nerve in his body alert. His mind raced. He had no weapons, no clear escape route. The window beside him led to the parking lot, where he knew officers were already waiting. The bathroom had no exit. His options were closing in fast. The knock came again, louder this time. "Jason, open the door. We know you're in there." Still, nothing. Outside, the officers exchanged a glance. They had seen this scenario play out too many times before. A fugitive, cornered, desperate, debating their next move. The hesitation could mean anything. Was he considering surrender? Was he about to destroy evidence? Or worse, was he preparing for a final act of defiance? They weren't going to wait to find out. A final warning was issued, but Jason never responded. That was enough. Within seconds, officers moved in. A battering ram was brought forward, and with one forceful strike, the door frame splintered, the lock gave way, and the door flew open. Inside, Jason stood in the middle of the room. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He didn't even speak. He simply raised his hands, a slow, almost theatrical motion, as if he had rehearsed it in his head 1,000 times. His face was blank, unreadable. No panic, no relief. Just a quiet, calculated surrender. The officers moved quickly, securing his wrists in handcuffs, frisking him for weapons, though they already knew he had none. His belongings were sparse. A duffel bag with a few clothes, some toiletries, a stack of cash, the last of what he had left from his escape. As they led him outside, the motel manager, who had been watching from behind the front desk, whispered something to an officer nearby. "He barely left that room," the man murmured. "Stayed in there all day, just pacing." The weight of those words settled over them all. Jason had been trapped long before they found him. He had nowhere left to go. Jason Bone was transported back to New York under heavy security. He sat in the back of the police vehicle, wrists cuffed, staring out the window as the neon-lit streets of Florida blurred past. The arrest had been clean, uneventful, but everyone knew that the real battle was about to begin. The moment he stepped foot into the interrogation room, everything would change. Interrogations weren't just about asking questions. They were about psychology, control, reading the room. And Jason Bone, by all accounts, was a man who had spent his entire life controlling people. Detectives had already reviewed his history, his past relationships, the patterns of manipulation that ran through every aspect of his life. They knew the kind of man he was. He wasn't going to break easily. Inside the cold, gray-walled interrogation room, Jason sat across from two seasoned detectives, his hands still cuffed to the metal table. A single overhead light cast long shadows across his face. The silence stretched between them. Detectives knew better than to start with accusations. They started with silence. Let him sit with it. Let the weight of his situation settle in. Most criminals couldn't stand silence. They filled it with nervous chatter, rambling explanations, half-truth that later unraveled. But Jason sat there completely still, his eyes steady, his breathing measured. He wasn't going to be the first to speak. The lead detective leaned forward, flipping open a file. Inside were crime scene photos, copies of text messages, the coroner's preliminary findings. He let Jason see the evidence. Let him absorb the reality of it. Then finally he spoke. "Tell me what happened to Danielle Thomas?" A simple question, director, no emotion. Jason didn't react, didn't blink. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, almost eerily detached. "I don't know what you're talking about." A lie, the first of many. The detective nodded slowly, as if expecting the answer. He turned one of the photographs around, sliding it toward Jason. The crime scene. Danielle's lifeless body in the bathtub. "You don't know what I'm talking about?" the detective asked, his voice cool, neutral. "Then explain this." Jason glanced down at the image, and for the first time something in his expression shifted. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't remorse. It was something else. Something calculating. Detectives had seen this look before. Jason wasn't just denying the crime. He was already planning his next move. The interrogation room was cold. Not uncomfortably so, but just enough to be noticeable. Enough to settle under the skin and make a person shift in their seat. It was an old trick, one of many detectives used in rooms like this. Temperature, lighting, silence. It all played a role in breaking a suspect down. But Jason Bone wasn't like most suspects. He sat motionless, his wrists still cuffed to the table, his expression as unreadable as ever. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even defiant. He was simply waiting. The detectives had seen this before. The calculated patience of someone who believed they could control the situation. Jason wasn't here to confess. He was here to play the game. But they had played this game before. The lead detective flipped through the case file in front of him, not rushing, not forcing the moment. Every second that passed was another second Jason sat there, stewing in his own silence. Finally, he pulled out a crime scene photo and placed it on the table. Danielle Thomas, the bathtub, the bruises, the waterlogged note. He didn't push it toward Jason, didn't force him to look. He just let it sit there. "You said you don't know what I'm talking about," the detective said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "So, help me understand. This is the woman you were living with, the woman who was found dead in your apartment, and you have nothing to say?" Jason's eyes flickered to the photo for the briefest second, then back up. "I wasn't there," he said. His voice was steady, emotionless. "I don't know what happened." The detective nodded slowly, as if he had expected the answer. He flipped another page in the file. "See, that's the problem," he continued, his tone still neutral, still measured. "Because we have you on security footage entering the building that night. We have your fingerprints in the bathroom. And we have your voice on a voicemail she left for a friend. Want to guess what you were saying in it?" Jason didn't blink. "I wasn't there," he repeated. It was a weak denial, and they both knew it. But Jason wasn't relying on logic to get out of this. He was relying on control, the same control he had used over Danielle, the same control he had used over others before her. The ability to lie, to manipulate, to twist reality until it suited him. The detective sat back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. He wasn't going to argue. He wasn't going to push. Not yet. Instead, he let the room go quiet again. Silence was an underappreciated weapon. People hated silence. It made them uncomfortable, made them fill the void with their own words. The ones who thought they could handle it, the ones like Jason, were often the first to crack when it stretched too long. And sure enough, after nearly a full minute, Jason shifted in his seat. Just a small movement, but it was the first sign that he wasn't as comfortable as he wanted them to believe. The detective reached for another piece of evidence, pulling out a stack of printed emails and messages recovered from Danielle's apartment. He slid them across the table, letting Jason see the words in black and white. "You think you can leave, but you won't. I won't let you. You don't understand what you're doing. You'll regret this. No one else will ever love you like I do." Jason's jaw tightened, just barely, a tiny flicker of something behind his eyes. Regret? Number recognition? He knew those words, because he had written them. The detective leaned in slightly, not aggressively, not threateningly, just enough to make Jason feel the space between them shrink. "Help me understand," he said again, softer this time. "Why would she be scared of you, Jason? Why did she feel like she had to leave?" Jason's fingers twitched, but his face remained blank. "She wasn't scared of me," he said. Another lie. The detective didn't call him out on it. He just nodded, letting the weight of the moment settle again. "You know what I think?" he said finally, voice barely above a murmur. "I think you knew she was going to leave you. I think you couldn't stand the idea of losing control. And I think when she told you it was over, you snapped." Jason didn't answer, but his breathing had changed, just slightly. The detective tapped the crime scene photo with his finger. "She fought back, didn't she?" he asked. Still, Jason said nothing, but his silence was no longer the same as before. Before it had been a choice, a form of control. Now it was something else entirely, a crack in the armor. The detective didn't push further. Not yet. He knew when to let things sink in. Instead, he stood, gathering the file, the photos, the evidence. "We're not in a rush, Jason," he said as he moved toward the door. "Take your time. Think about it. We'll talk again soon." And with that, he left Jason alone in the cold, silent room. A room that suddenly felt much smaller than before. The interrogation room felt different the second time Jason Bone was brought in. The first time, he had walked in with confidence, believing he could control the situation the same way he had controlled Danielle, through denial, manipulation, and the twisting of reality. But now the weight of evidence, time, and isolation had begun to wear him down. His posture wasn't as rigid. His hands, though still cuffed, no longer rested flat against the metal table, but sat loosely, fingers twitching slightly. His face, so carefully composed before, carried the faintest trace of something else now. Not guilt. Jason didn't do guilt. But fear. It was in the way he shifted in his chair, the way his eyes lingered a fraction too long on the crime scene photos this time, the way his breathing had become slower, more deliberate, as if he was trying to suppress something clawing its way to the surface. The lead detective sat down across from him again, mirroring the same posture he had the first time. No rush, no urgency, just patience and inevitability. Jason knew what they had on him. The evidence was airtight. He had been the last person seen entering Danielle's apartment. His fingerprints were inside. His own voice was on the voicemail where Danielle had sounded afraid. And then there were the messages, the ones that revealed a man losing control, a man who felt entitled to own another human being. The detective slid another sheet of paper across the table. It was a transcript of a call Jason had made to a friend shortly after Danielle was murdered. "I messed up," Jason had said. "I don't know what to do." For the first time, Jason swallowed hard. No more denials. No more "I wasn't there." No more pretending. The detective didn't ask a question. He just let the moment settle. And Jason did something he hadn't done before. He exhaled, a long, slow breath, like the air was being forced out of his lungs against his will. Then finally he spoke. "I didn't mean to kill her. It wasn't a confession. Not really. It was a justification, a way to frame the truth so he could live with it." The detective remained still, waiting. "I just—" Jason hesitated. "She was trying to leave me." There it was. Jason Bone had spent his entire life controlling people. He had convinced Danielle to stay when she wanted to leave before. He had used manipulation, charm, and, when those failed, fear. He had worn her down until she was trapped, until she felt like leaving him wasn't an option. But this time, she had made a decision. She was going to leave, and Jason couldn't accept that. "She said she was done," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I lost it." He admitted to grabbing her, to hitting her, to forcing her back inside when she tried to walk away. He admitted that she had begged him to stop, that she had tried to fight back, that he had been in such a rage he didn't realize how much damage he was doing. But none of that mattered, because the moment he put his hands on her, the moment he ignored her pleas, he had made a choice, and Danielle had paid the price for it. Jason sat there staring at the table, his breath coming slower now. For the first time, he looked small, like he was starting to understand that this wasn't just another fight he could talk his way out of. The detective nodded, and then he said the words that sealed everything. "You killed her, Jason." Jason didn't answer, because they both knew it was the truth. The trial of Jason Bone was swift and unforgiving. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His history of domestic violence, his obsessive control over Danielle, the way he had tried to manipulate her even in death, it all painted the picture of a man who thought he was untouchable until he wasn't. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. Jason Bone was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge's sentence was clear. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no deals, no chance for him to walk free again. Danielle Thomas had suffered for months before her murder. She had tried to leave, tried to escape, tried to take back her life. But Jason had stolen that from her, and now the justice system had taken his freedom in return. Danielle's family didn't celebrate the verdict. There was no real victory here. A conviction didn't bring her back. A life sentence didn't undo the pain she had endured. But there was a lesson in her story, one that her family, friends, and advocates for domestic violence survivors carried forward. Danielle had been a smart, successful, independent woman. She had a career, people who loved her, a bright future ahead of her, and yet she had still found herself trapped in a cycle of abuse, one that had ultimately cost her life. Because abuse isn't always obvious. It doesn't always start with bruises. It starts with control. It starts with words, with manipulation, with a slow, methodical process of making someone believe they don't have a choice. Danielle had a choice. Jason just refused to let her take it. And that's why this case mattered. Because there were other women out there right now, living Danielle's story. The ones who hadn't left yet. The ones who were scared to go. The ones who were waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity, the right excuse to walk away. Danielle's story was a warning, but it was also a plea. If you're in a situation like hers, don't wait. Don't stay. Don't let someone convince you that you don't have a choice. Because once you take that first step, once you leave, you might just save your own life. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.